And now the conclusion of our 3-part episode.
How then does one go to the perpetrators of this particular crime against Jussie and say, by the way, the same system of oppression that empowered you to attack this person is the same system of oppression that you yourself are a victim of? How do you get that message to people who are filled with such hatred and divisiveness? How do you really educate people and begin to shift the paradigm?
So I think the education needs to start way sooner than later. I think that that's fundamentally where we go wrong. 2 pieces. 1, we don't talk about this stuff in any real meaningful way early on in our educational systems of our lives. So we essentially continue to socialize our children to reinforce the systems that are already in play. And 2, once you get to a place of understanding, then you have to undo all of that negative learning and socialization that's happened to begin with. So it already puts you behind the curve. So you grow up in a context in which a lot of these hateful thoughts and ideas about difference and distinction become a part of how you just see the world to be. It's just what is. So you're talking about dismantling folks' entire worldviews. And that does not happen with a workshop. And it doesn't happen overnight with one class. It takes a period of time, actually, and a lot of efforts to work towards dismantling that need to happen explicitly and implicitly, with opportunities for contact with people that are different from themselves, that are not threatening, that don't reinforce violence, that don't reinforce systems of dominance. And the problem is lots of American ideals, the ideals of Americans, are counterintuitive to that. They are based on competition. They are based on rugged individualism. They are based on the idea of superiority. They are based on false notions of deserved privilege and opportunity. So we're really talking about dismantling American idealism if we're going to think about how we might unpack that. The other piece I will also add is the capacity for critical thinking is limited. Just critical thinking, irrespective of the content, but to be able to take a concept and break it down into its composite parts, to be able to ask what meaning exists, why, what else drives that, what's the derivation of that, how are these pieces interconnected. The process of critical thinking, I think, is at an all-time low. So I think we need more critical thinking education to start with, too.
I also want to add, and I know this is going to be to some people controversial, but
everything you say is controversial. What you talking
thanks about? I think we need to embrace the fact that when you're talking about American values and American culture and American ideology, that the gauge for that is white nationalism. And I think that we as Americans need to understand when they say the melting pot, it's a great melting pot, people of color aren't necessarily included in that idea or concept. When people think American, they don't think you or me. When America is sold overseas, you and I are not the face of that. Now, things have changed thanks to diversity in Hollywood and in our music and so on and so forth. Absolutely. Things have changed. But what's offered in the store doesn't mean that the reason why the store began has changed. You know what I mean? Like, it's still very much based on that white, nationalist, heterosexual, male perspective.
Yeah, 100%.
But the problem is people don't want to embrace that. Like, that's, and I'm sorry, I just got to get this out. The problem is people don't want to embrace that, because to embrace that almost feels like you're embracing something wrong. I don't think embracing the fact that we're a country that continued slavery after we said we wanted freedom is embracing something wrong or bad. It's embracing reality. And by embracing that reality, we're able to truly find our truth. But people don't even want to have those kinds of conversations because it's the past. Leave it in the past.
My response to that particular piece is nothing is the past. I am living all of the repercussions and consequences of the past. So is it really past?
You know, all I have is a sit for that.
You know. Is it really past?
Right.
I appreciate all of these comments. You know, this is all my jam. Like, this is what I love to teach. It's what I love to talk to my students about. I think it's the absolute space that we have to continue to work to be in, because things are at a really critical point. And at the same time, my natural propensity to be empathic and my years of training as a psychologist always brings me back to the individual as well. And so that is why I also think it's important to be able to talk about people that have been victims of hate crimes, people that have been victims of the current hateful, vitriolic kind of political landscape we live in, because the systems that we're talking about only matter if we also recognize the humanity of people that are victimized by the system. Otherwise, we're just talking about ideals and concepts, and we can argue those all day long.
Right.
But the ideals and the concepts literally distill down to actual individuals. And there is something that happens in the socialization of heterosexual white males in this country that gives them full license to behave in ways that reinforce dominance through violence. And that needs to be actionable by law. There has to be consequences to that. We can do that and simultaneously think about ways to dismantle the overall systemic socialization that creates that sort of young man. But we also have to have repercussions for that young man.
And so what concerns me is the tipping point. Being in New York City on September 11th and living here and seeing New York City post September 11th, you know, a lot of stuff was shut down for a while. But when people got back to their routines, at least to some degree, our first responders were our heroes. Our police were our friends. If an older person got on the train or a pregnant person got on the train, you would stand up. People would jump up out of their seat to give them a seat, that kind of thing. It was almost like an extended family in New York City. And as horrible as September 11th was, and the devastation and loss of life and me losing even personal friends, there was something beautiful about how New York City, and dare I say America, really came together. My concern is, with everything going the way it's going now, how horrible does this tipping point have to be?
Horrible. For
us to just say,
it's gotta be cataclysmic.
We gotta stop. And that's what I'm afraid of. So when you hear me speaking about, dismantle it and come back and deal, that's my concern, because I know what it took for New York City to become a wonderful place. And here's the thing. Fast forward 2019, I was riding the train yesterday, standing up, and a pregnant woman got on the train and no one moved. I said to her, "Would you like to lean against the door?" And she said, "Thank you." No one moved. People looked at her. No one moved. So we're back to that place. Mm-hmm. And it concerns me. And I also think that part of it annoys me because it doesn't need to be. Right? We don't need to have this divisiveness. We don't need to, go in these camps. We don't need to claim to be a civilized society, yet live in these tribalized zones on social media and otherwise, right? We don't need to do that. But we're choosing to do it, and we're choosing to justify it by saying that we are standing on moral authority and what we're doing is best for America. And what that equals is a man getting a Subway sandwich at 2:00 in the morning and being attacked.
I have been fortunate enough to be working with this local organization here in Houston called Project Curate. Shout out to Project Curate here. And we've been doing a 6-month curriculum called Frequencies, looking at ways that we can draw from Adrienne Maree Brown's emergent strategy to apply to our organizing and social justice work. And it has been absolutely a wonderful phenomenon for me personally. I hope that the work that I've been doing with my group and contributing to the overall project has been helpful, but I certainly know that I've been getting a lot out of it for me personally. So one of the things Adrienne Maree Brown talks about is this idea of resilience, right? We had this conversation in one of our sessions about resilience, about how do you keep coming back to do the work when you're derailed, when you are fatigued, when you're tired, when you've been hurt, when you've been denigrated, when you've been dismissed, et cetera, et cetera. There's conversation around, like, how do you find that middle ground that you're talking about, right? Like, how do we move away from the tipping point before we reach it? That's what and that I will be honest and say, that is where I get stuck. And I talked about this. So she talks about focusing on critical connections more than critical mass, build the resilience by building relationships. And this idea that, around like humility and being open, being vulnerable in the context of relationships. She also says, like, trust the people. If you trust the people, that they become trustworthy. I've talked about the fact that I find that hard to do as a Black woman, where I am marginalized and denigrated and demoralized within my Black community and in the broader racial hierarchy and in other relationships with women. I don't know how to build the bridge, how to be resilient in that way, how to trust the people when everything that I've been socialized tells me to distrust. That is really an inherent factor of my survival, to be distrustful of the other.
Can I say this? I think what you're saying is so important, and I'm going to use that because I think that we're similar in that regard, right? We've spoken, several times about the fact that I have friends that a lot of people would think as a gay Black man would not be my friend. People of different backgrounds and so forth. So because I have experienced homophobia, and that homophobia did not have a straight person's face. It had a straight person, a gay person, a bisexual. Mm-hmm. I've experienced racism and prejudice, and that didn't have a white versus Black. It Black, white, Asian, Latino. I've experienced all of that. What I don't do is sit in these polar places, or polarizing, places, and view white man enemy. This one over here is the problem. I tend to let people tell me who they are, and then I believe them when they tell me who they are, and I deal with them accordingly. Mm-hmm. So all I'm saying is, if we all did more of that, what we would find is that there really is no different. And these broad strokes that we're making about these people over there and those people over there are going to fall away. And what'll happen is, the true people who are oppressing, who are actively engaged in that rhetoric, they're going to become more prevalent. But now I can sit here as a Black man and say, white people do this, and paint that broad stroke and find 50 different justifications for it online. When I in my heart know that I have some friends who happen to be white who are ride or die. If I picked up the phone right now, they would be there. So it's difficult for us, well, for me, I'll say, and I'll keep it personal. It's difficult for me to buy into a lot of the narratives out there because they're not my reality. And all I'm saying is, why don't we do more of that? What is it about aligning yourself with these tribes? Like, maybe we need to find a way to de-incentivize that, right? We need to find a way to stop this frat and sorority mentality of people needing to be in these groups and these groups defining who they are. Instead, defining yourself and realizing that you're a member of different groups, different types of groups. And it's amazing. It's intersectional. That's all I'm saying. You're quiet. Go on. Go on. Shut me down. Say that I'm a dreamer.
Look, they call me a dreamer. Of killing dreams years ago, and one of the other the kind of fundamental takeaways that I have gotten from this emergent strategy framework and worldview is that you have to begin to imagine it for it to exist.
Right.
Like, you have to begin to imagine the world and create it in your mind before it will ever exist outside of you and in reality. And so if that is the world that you imagine, I'm not here to take that away from you at all.
But it's the world that I imagine, but the world that I also know is not the real world. So one thing I don't do is delude myself into thinking that because I don't have a problem with someone, that someone doesn't have a problem with me. So I don't want you to think that you can run up on me in